Let's get into the details here with Congresswoman Debbie Lesko. She represents Arizona's 8th Congressional District, and she's on a bunch of important subcommittees, too. She joins us on the phone right now. Congresswoman, great to have you with us.
It's always great to be on air with you.
Tell me about this spending plan. What do you make of it, and what will it achieve if it actually passes?
Well, as Speaker McCarthy said, if it passes, it will save $4.5 trillion in savings to the taxpayers. So there's multiple parts to it. The first part is it limits federal spending. So what it would do is would lock in spending levels at the fiscal year 22 levels. That would save about $3.6 trillion. It also allows for a limited 1% annual growth in discretionary spending over the next 10 years. Then it saves taxpayer dollars by reclaiming unspent COVID funds, which would save about $50 to $60 billion. It defunds the IRS, 87,000 IRS agents, which would save $71 billion. It repeals all of the Democrats' Green New Deal tax credits that they shoved through when they were in the total majority, and that's a savings of between $271 billion and $1.2 trillion. It prohibits Biden's student loan giveaway which would save another $465 billion. Then we go into an area where we actually want to grow the economy, which would help the budget. And the one way to do that is to require able-bodied adults between the ages of 18 and 55 years old to work. They either have to work, or they have to go to school, or they have to go to work training. And this is just able-bodied adults. There's a bunch of exclusions for pregnant women, disabled people, but these are the people that can work or go to school, and we only require that they work or go to school for 80 hours in a month, which isn't very much. I actually think it should be more. Mm-hmm. But the savings for that is approximately $110 to $120 billion.
Sure, and we saw and we saw the reforms that came with welfare work requirements in the 90s. Those were a rousing success. So why not do things that actually have succeeded in the past?
Well, exactly. And, back then it was Clinton, right? And so because of Republicans were pushing the work requirements, he went along with it. And there's no reason that people that are getting either SNAP, which is food stamps, or TANF, which is money, temporary assistance for needy families, money, or Medicaid benefits, that if they're able-bodied, they should work. That's only fair.
And the reason for that, and the reason for that is to cultivate independence rather than dependence. That's what you're trying to create.
Exactly.
And you don't want people to become perpetually dependent on the government. That's how you make a sad country. These are obvious things, and I'm glad to hear that they're a part of this. Another thing that I'm glad to hear is that you're imposing some threshold, basically spending level threshold. You say no more than 2022. Now, already spending is astronomical. 2022 spending was astronomical, but this reminds me of the sequestration back in the early teens, where you had basically Congress couldn't agree on a budget, and finally the agreement was, okay, we're just going to set some limits to from a prior year spending, and that's where we'll keep it. And I love how Washington gets all upset that they can't increase spending, but man, Washington's already spending out of control.
They already are, and this spending level was just in place like 4 months ago. So it's not really outrageous that we limit it at fiscal year 2022 levels. In fact, I would like it, probably less than that. But hey, you need a bill that can get the votes of 218 members, and so that's what we're going for. Included in this bill is also enacting the REINS Act, which would say that a president cannot do executive orders that cost money to Americans. It has to go through Congress. And we're also including H.R. 1, which is our bill that we passed out of the House that would lower gasoline and energy prices for the American public. And those are the things that we're asking for, and we'll see if Biden comes to the table. So far, he has not been willing to come to the table at all, and I think that's very irresponsible.
Yeah, Biden saying this week that this is the MAGA economic agenda. Spending cuts for working and middle-class folks is not about fiscal discipline. It's about cutting benefits for folks that they don't seem to care much about. So this seems to be Joe Biden just rejecting this offer out of hand. What happens if Biden doesn't agree to some reasonable cuts here?
Well, there's going to be a bit of a standoff, isn't there? And
yes.
So, hopefully the American people, the reason we're doing this is to show what Republicans stand for. We stand for responsible government spending, not ridiculously increased government spending, and we have logical, common sense reforms that we have in place. Now, we cannot go on the path that we are going on. We cannot continue to do what Biden and the Democrats have done, because projections have shown that our interest payments on our national debt in as few years as 5 years are going to exceed the entire budget of the Department of Defense. Now, that's a national security risk, right? So if we can't pay for any funding for the Department of Defense, we're in bad shape because we're spending all of the money on interest payments on our debt. It's totally unsustainable. So we're the responsible adults here. We have to stop this government spending because, quite frankly, it's the taxpayer dollars that we're spending, and we're not being responsible with taxpayer dollars. I mean, for goodness sakes, I'm on the Energy and Commerce Committee and the Oversight Subcommittee. We had inspector generals come into our committee hearing and testify that these agencies aren't even keeping track of the grant money that they were giving in the $50 million range. But now the Democrats have all these grants going through Department of Energy that will be hundreds of billions of dollars. So if they can't even manage to figure out how an audit and keep track of $56 million, how are they going to keep track of all this money, billions of dollars going out? They're not going to. There's going to be fraud and waste and abuse.
All of this spending increases expenses for American citizens. So you and Congress don't even need to pass a tax increase. Americans have their taxes going up in the form of inflation. And now we're looking at national debt of nearly $32 trillion. And it only gets worse with every excessive government spending program. So, man, I hope you can actually rein this in for real. I do want to mention at least one or two other issues with you. I know you've been following, Congresswoman Debbie Lesko, the origins of COVID conversation. It seems with each passing week we get more and more information about more government spending and the role it may have played in the invention of the coronavirus pandemic. What do you know?
Well, I'm on the select subcommittee for COVID, and we've had some really interesting hearings, especially on the origins of COVID. But we had John Ratcliffe, the former director of national intelligence, came in front of our select subcommittee this week and basically said there's no other explanation except that it came from the Wuhan lab. And there is evidence that the military was working with the Wuhan lab. So we don't know for sure if it was an intentional bioweapon, as some people think, and other people don't.
Sorry, when you say, let me pause for a second on this. I'm sorry, Congressman. When you say the military was working with the Wuhan lab, are you referring to the American military or the Chinese military?
No. I'm sorry, the Chinese military.
Thank you.
And in fact, in September of 2019, 3 things happened at this lab. First of all, they deleted the virus sequence, the genome sequence.
Yes.
Then they changed over the control of the lab from civilian control to military control. Then they changed out the ventilation system at the lab. But then, in addition to that, the testimony this week in committee, there's a former Secretary of State official, Mr. Feith, who was an expert in Asian issues, and he said that there were researchers at the Wuhan lab that were sick in the fall of 2019. And so John Ratcliffe said if the Chinese would have told us this, we could have prevented the pandemic from happening. Of course, the Chinese did not. The Chinese are hiding information. And I also, in another committee hearing, because I'm on oversight committee for Energy and Commerce Committee, I asked the National Institute of Health director if the money that went to EcoHealth Alliance that then funneled money to the Wuhan lab to do virus research caused the coronavirus pandemic.
Yeah.
And he said, it had nothing to do with it. Well, I find that very questionable because all of the data was deleted. The Chinese asked the NIH to delete the data, and for whatever reason the NIH did.
Yes.
They didn't get reports. So how in the world would this guy know that? It just seems there's too much evidence that there was gain-of-function research going on in the Wuhan lab, and that U.S. taxpayer dollars were funding part of it, and that it was released from the lab.
And I saw that in his testimony, John Ratcliffe did say, quote, some of Dr. Fauci's testimony is inconsistent with some of the information that remains classified, as well as inconsistent with some of the information that is publicly available. In other words, Fauci appears to have, at the very least, gotten something wrong, but at worst, lied explicitly to Congress about some very important details here.
Well, Dr. Fauci has been all over the map on what he's saying to Congress and the American people. I mean, he was involved in this report that emphasized that it was caused by natural causes, natural origin, right? He was involved in screening the report, editing the report, and then one of the scientists said to Dr. Fauci, said, hey, this report of proximal origin was the name of the report, hasn't quelled this conspiracy theory that COVID came from the lab. And so the very next day, Fauci goes on TV at a White House press conference and says, here's this evidence of the proximal origin that says, it's natural origin, when he's the one that edited it. And then Dr. Redfield, the former CDC director, also testified in our committees and said that he told Dr. Fauci that he believed it came from the lab, and Dr. Fauci excluded him from conference calls and other meetings.
Yeah. It is just wild. All right, Congresswoman Debbie Lesko, thank you so much for digging in on this. Please keep seeking answers there and maybe cut some spending in the process. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time.
I think we should cut some spending. You're right about that.
I hope
Thank
so.
you so much. You take care.
I'm tired of paying so much for eggs.